Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Burns. I teach at the Kennedy School. I direct our Future Diplomacy Project, one of the sponsors for tonight's lecture, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you, and pleased to welcome my friend Nick Kristof. We both want to apologize that we're late. We have a very good excuse. We were meeting with Dean Elwood. That's a good excuse here at the Kennedy School. But our apologies if we did keep you waiting. I wanted to say a few words about Nick, and then go over the ground rules for tonight, and I think it's going to be a great session. This lecture is co-sponsored by the Women in Public Policy program and by the Shorenstein Center. So three of us are sponsoring Nick's lecture tonight. I want to tell you a bit about him. You've probably seen his biography, but he's had a really extraordinary career. He's a graduate of Harvard College with honors, Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, studied on his own initiative after Oxford both Arabic and Mandarin. He's an inveterate traveler. He has lived on 4 continents. He's reported from 6 continents. He's traveled to more than 150 countries. I think there are 192 member states of the General Assembly of the United Nations. You have more work to do and more travel. And my personal favorite, he is one of the few Americans, he claims, I think he's probably right, to be a 2-time visitor to each of the axis of evil countries. That is a great distinction. He is a longtime reporter for the New York Times, both in the field and also in New York. He was associate managing editor of the Sunday edition. That's one of the great rituals of American life, the Sunday New York Times. He covered the Tiananmen Square democracy movement with his wife, Cheryl DeWin. They won a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting from Tiananmen Square. He is a 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He's the author of several books, including a book that I know a lot of us have read, Half the Sky, From Oppression to Opportunity for Women Worldwide. That was co-authored with his wife, Cheryl DeWin. He is now columnist for the New York Times. That is a very special and privileged position because he gets to write twice a week whatever he wants to write about. And what has always intrigued me about Nick and his column in the Times is that he does not report from the establishment's point of view. And he does not occupy himself with grand strategy the way so many columnists do. And I'm going to continue filibustering until this is right over here. But the point I wanted to make to a lot of you, and I made it to my class when I encouraged every member of the class to be here, and I see a lot of people from my class here, is that I think that what has distinguished Nick's column is that he reports from the perspective of average people around the world and poor people around the world, and from the victim's perspective. And I think he's among our major columnists across this country. He's one of the few that takes that perspective. Whether it's the challenges that women face all around the world, or Darfur, or poverty, or hunger, Nick is reporting from the victim's perspective up until yesterday's column, which I'm sure all of you read in anticipation of this program. And I really admire him for that, because he has given voice to people who normally wouldn't have a powerful voice in our society. He's traveled at least 10 times to Darfur as an example of his tenaciousness as a reporter and as a columnist. So I mentioned to Nick, that's what I've loved about his column for many years. And I think that we're going to have a very interesting talk about this subject, Half the Sky. A New York Times columnist talks about women as a solution to global problems. Please join me in welcoming Nick Kristof.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. This is already actually beginning more auspiciously than my last visit to the Kennedy School. I gave the commencement speech a few years ago, and I actually took my daughter, who was then about maybe 10 years old, out of school so she could see this moment when her dad is being honored, to show, some people actually respect her dad and actually might listen to him. And I thought this might be a novelty to her. And so as we were actually walking toward the K School, we noticed this flood of people rushing across the street toward Widener. And it was just like a sea of people going over there. And I stopped somebody and asked him, why is everybody going that way? And well, it turned out that that was the undergraduate Harvard graduation. The day speaker was Bill Clinton, who was speaking at exactly the same moment that I was speaking. And so I stopped and I just said to my daughter, Caroline, I just want you to know that this may be a little bit humiliating. We may get there, and you may be the only one there to listen to me. And she paused and then said, Daddy, can I go hear Bill Clinton? So I did not bring her this time. Well, I think people are always kind of surprised that a columnist for the New York Times especially should be writing about some of these kinds of issues, and especially writing so often about women's rights around the world. And the origin for this, to some degree, goes back to when Cheryl and I were living in China. That half the sky, ban bian tian, do you know? 你会说中国话吗? Okay, it means ban bian tian is half the sky, a Chinese expression. And Cheryl and I were in China. Can you see that, or am I like totally blocking your view? Okay. It was really there. This was a few months ago in Tiananmen Square, and okay. One way of gauging it actually is that my son Gregory, who's on my shoulders there, he is now doing a gap year in China actually, and will show up here next fall. Which underscores how quickly they grow in just a few months. But when we were in China, we were sort of fascinated by the question of what makes countries develop, what makes countries grow, what's the secret of East Asia. And of course, every country had a different economic model. South Korea's was immensely different from Singapore's, from China's, and so on. But the common thread, to a considerable degree, was not exactly policy as such, but it was really that they took village girls who traditionally had contributed negligibly to the economy and then educated them and then gave them the autonomy to join the formal labor force and just watched productivity just balloon outward and created this kind of a virtuous spiral of development. And this was kind of encapsulated for Cheryl and me when we visited this school. It's in Hubei province in the Dabie Mountains, very poor area. This was 1990. This girl was the brightest kid in school and had to drop out because she couldn't pay $13 in school fees. And that was typical, that when kids dropped out, it was girls, because parents didn't want to invest in their daughters in a way that they might have with boys. And I wrote an article about this phenomenon and used this girl, Diamont You, as my kind of poster girl for this phenomenon. Brightest kid in school has to drop out, wanted $13. So you can imagine what happens. I'm soon deluged with letters from readers, all containing checks for $13. Times readers are unbelievably generous in small amounts. And so we also, though, got one wire transfer for $10,000 to help Diamont You. We took all this money down to Hubei, worked out a deal with the principal, who's there beside her, that this money would be used for girls who were academically promising, to keep them in school without requiring school fees. Those girls were thrilled. For the first time in this community, your prospects would be a function not of your chromosomes, but of your intellectual capacity. We called up the donor of the $10,000 to express thanks, and he seemed surprised. We said, "You just wouldn't believe how far $10,000 will go in rural China." Well, there was this stunned pause, and he said, "But I didn't send $10,000. I sent $100. Yes, that was our reaction exactly. We gasped. It turned out, indeed, that the bank had made an error. He'd only tried to send $100, but the bank had had a little trouble with that decimal point. We figured that banker was later put in charge of subprime mortgages. You figure? So we just didn't know what to do. We couldn't go back to these girls and tell them, no, you're not going to have your education paid for. I'm not really proud of what we did next. I called up the chief spokesman for the bank, whom I knew in another context. And I explained the situation, explained exactly they'd made this mistake. The girls were relying on it to get an education. Then I just happened to mention the follow-up article I was working on. And then I asked, so now on the record, are you planning to try to get back that $9,900 and force all these girls to drop out of school? He didn't miss a beat. He said, on the record, under the circumstances, we're delighted to make a donation of the difference. So as a result, what you had was a fascinating natural experiment in what happens when you invest in girls' education in one community in a way that you don't in the surrounding areas. And one of the toughest things in development, as you know, is how to separate correlation and causation, and how you manage to check what really is an exogenous factor versus what is simply intricately related to everything else. Well, here we had this exogenous factor of a bank error, and we were able, over the 20 years since then, to go back periodically and look at this village, or this community, and all the others nearby. And it was fascinating to watch the impact. Diamont You herself became the first person in her family to graduate from elementary school, from middle school, from high school, and then earned an accounting degree. Went down to Guangdong province, became an accountant, later started a private company, sent money back, which is used to start small businesses in that area. And so many other girls who otherwise would have been in the rice paddies or tending goats ended up getting a great education and investing those returns in that community. And so it was transformative for this community. You know, make no mistake, all of China has become much wealthier over the years. People have become better educated. But this community truly was transformed far and away beyond the others, all because of this one-time error by this banker, this dumb banker. That is not the principle to learn, that we need more dumb bankers. But it is the power of this investment. And it really was, you know, thinking about that and seeing those returns, that over the time, you know, the more we looked at this area, the more we approached the two themes that eventually coalesced in Half the Sky. The first theme really goes to the fact that it is always girls who end up dropping out of school when there aren't enough resources. And our argument there is that just as in the 19th century, the central moral challenge for the world was slavery, and in the 20th century, the paramount moral challenge was totalitarianism. In this century, the central moral challenge, and really the cause of our times, the cause of your times, is going to be gender inequity around the globe. When one says that, I think people sometimes think that we're exaggerating, this is hyperbole, it's meant as a way of getting people's attention. It's really not. To explain why, let me turn the tables and ask you a question. Are there more males or females in the world today? Actually, I heard some dissent there. Let's have a show of hands. If you think there are more males in the world today, can you raise your hand? And if you think there are more females in the world today, can you raise your hand? I'm afraid this latter group is wrong. First group was right. In the United States, there are more females. In Europe, there are more females. In this room, there are definitely more females. Given equal access to food and health care, women live longer. In an equitable world, there would be more females. But the point is, this is not an equitable world. This is a picture I took in Ethiopia. You look at it, you see hunger. But what you also need to know is that every kid in this emergency feeding center was a girl. And this girl's brothers were doing just fine. And in so much of the world, when there isn't enough food, you feed your son and you starve your daughter. When your son is sick, you take him to the doctor. When your daughter is sick, you feel her forehead and sort of say, well, let's see how you're doing tomorrow. And the upshot is differentials in mortality rates that are truly quite stunning, and that result in, depending on who does the math, somewhere between 60 and 110 million females missing around the world. There's also, I must say, a function partly of sex-selective abortion, which is an issue in a number of countries. But that is why there are more males than females globally. And the upshot of that is that in any 10-year period, there are more females discriminated against to death than all the people who were killed in all the genocides of the 20th century. It's a stunning figure. And when you think of it in those terms, then how can it not be the central moral challenge of the century? The other theme that we try to emphasize is maybe a happier one, and that is that putting aside all the injustices and all the terrible things that happen to women, just at a purely practical point, if you want to chip away at poverty, if you want to chip away at insecurity, at terrorism, at violence, then the most cost-effective way of doing that is to invest in women and girls, in girls' education, and then bring those women into the formal labor force and see the same kind of virtuous spiral unfold that happened with Diamont You. Put it another way, women and girls aren't the problem, they're the solution. And it's true for a number of reasons. One is birth rates. You can't begin to address so many global problems, including actually security issues, unless you deal with birth rates and then this youth bulge, which seems a nasty thing to say to a bunch of young people. But one of the most destabilizing things to happen in any population is the proportion of young people aged 15 to 24. And that is a function of very high birth rates. And I have to say that I think also another reason why there are you get extra bang for the buck investing in women and girls is something that I think is something of a dirty little secret in development. And that is that one of the problems of global poverty is not just low incomes, but it's also bad spending decisions. And those are disproportionately by men. And there's a fair amount of evidence on this, although the numbers are quite fuzzy. But if one could take some small share of the proportion of money that goes to alcohol, tobacco, and prostitution and put it into education, that would have a transformative effect. And the way you can do that is give women more legal title over land, for example, over homes, and give women more ability to generate income. And by education, for example, or programs to start businesses. And then the other reason to focus on women is just that those are the squandered assets. That if you think about what poor countries have, what resources they have that are underutilized, it's not oil and it's not seams of gold, it's the female halves of their population. Bill Gates put it quite well, I thought, on a visit to Saudi Arabia. He was speaking to an audience. There's a barrier in the middle of the room, men on one side, a much smaller group of women on the other, and somebody asked him about whether Saudi Arabia can become one of the top 10 countries in technology. And he made the point, this point of utilizing resources, Bill of Arabia, that if you're not fully utilizing half the talent in the country, then you're not going to get too close to the top 10. Just as a question of utilizing resources intelligently, one has to provide some kind of greater equality to the female half of the population. Well, if this is indeed the cause of our times, what would an agenda look like? One thing that I think has to be much higher on the global agenda is human trafficking, and what I think really is modern slavery. These are girls who were kidnapped in rural Cambodia, sold to the brothels. They don't get any of the money that is paid to the brothel owners. They don't have any say about anything. This is a girl called Long Pros who was kidnapped at 14 in Cambodia, sold to a brothel. She was thought to be insufficiently cooperative. The brothel owner gouged out her eye. When you have a situation like that, what do you call that but slavery? And indeed, there are a couple of differences from classical slavery. One is scale. The peak of transatlantic slavery was actually the 1780s, and just under 80,000 slaves a year were transferred from Africa to the New World each year, about 78,000 a year in the 1780s. These days, numbers are fuzzier, and there's certainly definitional issues of what a slave is, but the State Department figure was 800,000 a year transferred across international borders, which doesn't even include people like Long Cross who were stuck within one country. Another difference in traditional slavery has to do with, in a sense, their commercial value. One of the things that protected a slave in the 1850s was that they were valuable to their owner. In today's money, a slave in the 1850s was worth about 40,000 US dollars in today's money. An owner did not want that slave to die. In contrast, a girl in India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Cambodia is worth a few $100s. And that is why an owner will gouge out a girl's eye. They're disposable. I became somewhat notorious back in 2004. I bought 2 girls from their brothels, including this one, Stray Net, and this one in the white blouse, Stray Mum. And what really, and took them back to their families. We tried to start them with small businesses. What really struck me about that whole transaction, though, was that I got receipts. When you get a receipt for buying a human being in the 21st century, that really should be a disgrace on us all. Another issue that I think has to be higher on the agenda, and is one actually that has been getting traction in the last year or two. Well, I mean, trafficking actually in the last 10 years or so really has. The next one, maternal health, is one that more recently really has been. And just last week at the UN General Assembly, it was stunning to see, one of the events that was toughest to get into. You saw these, heads of state trying to sort of elbow their way in to the meeting hall. Was a session that Ban Ki-moon chaired on maternal health. And the notion that you would have all these people struggling to talk about how much they cared about an issue that they were oblivious to a few years ago was a real, I think, tribute to the way this is beginning to get attention. It's not only that 1,000 women a day die in childbirth, it's also that for every woman who dies, about 20 are injured. And that was really the way I came into this issue, that back in 2002 I encountered women in Sudan who had suffered something called an obstetric fistula, which was just the saddest thing you can ever see. That's what happened to this woman, Maha Booba. It typically happens when a teenage girl whose pelvis isn't big enough to accommodate the baby's head, gets pregnant, can't give birth on her own, there's no doctor around to do a C-section, baby gets stuck, baby dies, she suffers internal injuries, is left incontinent, typically dribbling waste, smelling, unable to control her bowel often, and often crippled as well. And she's a teenager. Maha Booba was married off at 13 to a much older man. Never consulted, became pregnant, gave birth at 14 by herself in the bush. No doctor around. She suffered two kinds of fistulas, as well as nerve damage in both legs. And then the village, thinking that she had been cursed by God, put her in a hut at the edge of the village and pulled off the door so the hyenas would get her that night. She's 14 years old. She's also just the toughest, most unbelievable woman you can imagine. Just extraordinary woman. And there was a stick in that hut. When the hyenas came, even though she's weak from loss of blood, she's exhausted, she takes the stick all night, she waves it around her head and shouts to try to keep the hyenas away. She does that all night. At dawn, she knows that her only hope is to get to a missionary, an American missionary who lives 30 miles away. Remember, she can't walk. She sets off at dawn crawling. At nightfall, she's still far away. She pulls herself into a tree so the hyenas won't get her that night. The next dawn, she lets herself down again, starts crawling again. she finally arrives half dead at the door of this missionary. He immediately sees and, well, tells from the smell, frankly, that she's got a fistula. Takes her to a hospital in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where she gets a $300 surgery from an American OBGYN, Steve Arrowsmith, that gives her life back. And while she's recovering, the hospital staff realize that Maha Booba is actually really smart. And so they ask her to help out, and they train her, and now she's a nurse at that same hospital. And to me, it's just a wonderful reminder that what we're dealing with here isn't just tragedies, it's also opportunities. And the key is to take these people who are squandered assets and make them truly productive for their own sake, for the sake of their communities, their countries. And that's exactly what Maha Booba is now. It's just utterly inspiring to me. Truly one of my heroes. Another area to focus on is ways of promoting economic development and growth. Microfinance is in some ways a stand-in for that. Micro savings is one of the things that I get really excited about in my more wonkish moments. And this actually involves Simon Mohammed was a woman outside Lahore, and in her case it was a micro loan that made the difference. She'd been married to a guy who was a bit of a loser. He was a gambler. He was unemployed, pretty much unemployable. He dealt with his frustrations by beating her up each afternoon. She didn't have any money to feed the kids. The family was in debt. And then she got a $65 loan from an awesome microfinance organization in, is Sadaf here? Sadaf, okay. So Sadaf was working with Cash, that organization, and was with me when I took this picture. And so I should let you tell about Cash. But so she got a $65 loan from Cash, and then Simon used that to start this microfinance business, this embroidery business. She was really good at it. She started selling all she could to the markets in Lahore. They wanted more and more and more, and so then she began to hire other women in the community to make embroidery as well. Pretty soon she's hired 30 people there. She's the biggest employer in her village. And then at that point she needs to hire somebody to transport all this embroidery over to Lahore. So she hires her husband. He begins to take a whole new perspective on female empowerment. And I must say that there is a real risk that if you focus too much on women, there is a risk of a backlash. And there are real trade-offs here. But in general, over time, it seems to me that men come to appreciate that they are as much beneficiaries as anybody else. This is not a zero-sum game, that when their wives or their daughters get educated and earn more income, that their own standard of living rises very much as well. One of the things we've learned, I think, that there are no silver bullets in development. Everything is harder than it looks. Nothing works as well as we hope. But to me, at least, the closest you can get is education. And for girls' education, you seem to get a little bit more bang for the buck than for boys' education, partly because of the gender gap in a lot of countries. We're also, I think, getting a better sense of the complexity of development and how one can make a difference. It is not just about building schools, for example. In Afghanistan right now, I would argue that the best way to have schools is actually to hold schools in the mosques. Because in the mosque they get a little bit of protection to some degree. They're kind of a divine, divine stamp of approval to some Taliban if the classes are held in the mosque. It doesn't work in every case; depends on the imam. But it's less about bricks and mortar and things like we don't think about deworming. We never think about deworming because none of us have intestinal worms. Most school kids in much of the world do, and the result is that they're anemic, that they are sick more often, that they miss school. And that is treatable with one little pill, something called albendazole. Take that once a year, and you will not have worms. And it costs 50 cents, including delivery costs, to get those deworming pills to these kids. And then absenteeism drops, depending on the study, very significantly. But one study indicated it's 25 times cheaper to get more kids in school by deworming them than by bricks and mortar. Another thing we never tend to think about as an impediment for high school girls, the reason they drop out, is difficulty managing menstruation. Because this is something of a taboo in a lot of societies. It's something people don't talk about. And so as a result, people really weren't aware that high school girls were typically staying home during their periods and getting more and more behind and then dropping out. And so now aid groups are beginning to focus on this, and a study in Ghana found that providing sanitary pads to girls cut their absenteeism by half, which is an incredibly cost-effective intervention. And so I think we're getting kind of smarter about how to go about this. And my favorite story, Beatrice. This is a Ugandan girl named Beatrice. She grew up near the Congo border. She's 9 years old in this picture. And her parents did not send her to school, because she was a girl. Then the family got a goat through Heifer International. I'm sure you know Heifer. And they sold the milk to have a little more income. As a result, they felt a little flusher with cash. They could afford the school fees. They sent Beatrice to school. She turned out to be a bit of a prodigy. And as a result, she rocketed to the top of her class. All during elementary school, she's at the top of her class. Middle school and high school, she's doing really well in the nationwide standard exams. Then she becomes the first person in her community to go abroad to study and graduates from Connecticut College. That's her. This is her graduation party. She proclaims, "I'm the luckiest girl in the world, and it's all because of a goat." There are a couple of skeptical questions that I think people sometimes have and ask. And one is the question of whether it makes a difference. And that is partly a function of work by Bill Easterly, by Dambisa Moyo, concerns about aid effectiveness. And I must say, I think that those are legitimate concerns, and that there has been some risk that the humanitarian community has exaggerated how easy it is to make a difference. It really is tough. Anybody who has traveled through the developing world, and I'm sure an awful lot of you have, has seen projects that have been started with the best of intentions, and then a part breaks, and there's no system in place to replace that part. And in Central African Republic, if you need a well part, that's it. And a part for your pump, that's it. And so you see these abandoned projects. It is hard, but I think that what we're also learning is that there are an awful lot of projects that are immensely successful. And I mean, education tends to have a very good record. Health projects tend to have a good record. Some kinds of empowerment and microfinance projects have a solid record. We're getting a better sense of what works and measuring that kind of bang for buck. And I think that as a result, we have a much better handle now on how to go about making the difference. The other thing I would say on that effectiveness point is that I think one mistake that our generation made is that we were very focused on solving problems as a whole. And so we saw some injustice and we wanted to pass UN resolutions or create some kind of global institutional architecture to resolve it. And often, frankly, the consequences were largely symbolic and they didn't really affect very many people. And increasingly I've come to believe that the alternative approach, which seems to be one that your generation favors more, is, while keeping up the pressure on at the global level, go ahead and start one particular sponsor a particular third grade class in a particular school in a particular refugee camp somewhere. It's not going to solve the global problem, but for those kids in that third grade class, it'll be transformative. And I really believe that is increasingly the way I kind of see this perspective. I'm kind of embarrassed to, this is such a hokey story that I'm kind of embarrassed to say this in, at Harvard. But it's kind of how I see this. This is a Hawaiian parable that I bet some of you know. And it's about the boy walking on the beach. You know this one? And all these starfish have washed up, and he's throwing the starfish madly back, and a man comes along and says, "What are you doing? There are millions of starfish. You can't make a difference." The boy reaches down and throws another one in and says, "Well, sure made a difference to that one." And I think that's exactly right. That is one way of kind of seeing these issues. I hope that you will get engaged in this kind of an issue. Cheryl and I wrote the book not so much to inform people, but with the hope of really galvanizing them. And maybe let me leave you with a story of a friend of mine who, kind of actually the age of a bunch of you who are at the Case School. Young American woman. I met her in Sudan. She was an aid worker in Darfur. She saw things that no human being should ever have to see. She was unbelievably tough in Sudan. And then she came back to the U.S. over Christmas vacation. She's in her grandmother's backyard, and she utterly breaks down. And she's just weeping on the ground. And you know what it was? Her grandmother had set up a bird feeder. And my friend thought about how she'd just come from a place where people were throwing babies into bonfires based on the color of their skin and the tribe they belonged to. And thought how she had the unbelievable good fortune to be born in a country where we take security for granted, where we have the extraordinary wealth not only to feed and clothe and house ourselves, but to help ensure that wild birds can get through the winter. And she just sort of saw her life in a new perspective, and with it, an obligation as well. And I think about that. I mean, the fact that we are in this room right now means we have all won the lottery of life. And with it then does indeed come the question of how one discharges that obligation. So I hope you'll join in this larger movement and help change the world and gain perspective. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you. Compelling presentation. I think for everybody in the room, compelling. And it reminded me that what we study here, international politics, has to be about more than presidents, prime ministers, and nation states. It has to be about people, especially poor people, and women in this case. And Iris Bonet, my colleague, and I have spent the day together with Monty Ahtisaari over at the business school. Iris just came from a session with President Ahtisaari. Iris chairs the Women in Public Policy program. I thought we should give Iris the first chance to maybe a few comments on this subject and any question you want for her.
Thank you so much. We're so delighted to have you here, Nick. Your book left such an impression on me personally and everyone else. And let me start by actually talking about something that we're doing here, because you just mentioned about what we teach at the Kennedy School. So this year, for the first time, Rohini Panda, development economist, and I teach a new course at the Kennedy School on closing the gender gap, which is all about how do you do that? How do you close gender gaps in economic opportunity, political participation, health and education. And I'm sorry I came late, but I literally was on a podium before interviewing President Ahtisaari. It's hard. It is very hard to prove the efficiency case in addition to the equality case, right? Equality is about, we care about gender equality because it's a human right, and efficiency is what you, I think, spent talking about today. Does it really increase development? And to prove that $1 of aid yields higher returns than $1, which is what we have to prove, is hard. And so, one more comment. Like 2 weeks ago, we had the World Bank here trying to learn from us about the Human Development Report in 2012, which is going to focus on gender. And they're struggling with the same question. And they were like, don't we have, where's the research? Don't we have these 50 studies which really measure cleanly what difference really makes and what the impact is? And we don't. It's hard to do. And many of us are involved in it, in program evaluation and small studies and really measuring what's going on. But it's hard to do. And so my question is now actually related to something that we discussed with the World Bank, is maybe we also have to start thinking about measurement more creatively. So here are two thoughts, and not that I have an answer to it, and maybe you've talked about it, and I know you talked about it in your book. There's some new developments which are also happening now. So this is also a special time for us in many ways. There was the economic crisis, many asked the question, what if? But also in many countries of the world, including in developing countries like in Latin America, the gender gap in education has reversed. So that raises very new questions in a very different part of society, like in the private sector, of what are we not getting if we don't get these highly educated women? Do we have to go with, excuse me for the man in the room, second best? I'm saying that just because, in fact, the gender gap in education has reversed in those countries. And so the question is, well, we're spending all this money on educating all these women, and now they're disappearing from society. Is that a smart thing? And how would we measure that? How would we measure the opportunity costs of not benefiting from these women? And the second point, which you probably talked about, is gender side. Of course, that we now know that we have many more statistics say like 120 boys for 100 girls in Southeast Asia. What are the societal consequences of that? And can we measure, the difference that difference make, or investments in women, maybe more creatively and more holistically, in addition to clearly measuring what the return on investment is? So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks very much. More power to you. It is great to see the work being done here. That's a sort of armload of observations and questions. Let me just sort of toss out a few thoughts. One of the I think it's very true that the quality of the research has sometimes been exaggerated, and the World Bank in particular did a lot of studies on women and girls' education beginning in the 1980s, and essentially they looked at correlations, and you could find all kinds of benefits from educating girls through correlations, but the problem is correlation and causation can be very different, and there are lots of reasons why educated girls might have better outcomes that don't have to do with education. They're more likely to be urban, they're more likely to be better off, they're more likely to marry more educated husbands, and so on. And disentangling them is somewhat harder. There are some studies that I think have made some progress in that, where there is a little more of an exogenous factor, sudden increase in girls' education, and one can measure the output, the changes in that cohort. But it's but that has been hard. But for me, I think that people who care about this issue tend to emphasize the human rights argument, the injustices issue. I think that actually that tends to be an argument that works when you're preaching to the choir, but is much less persuasive when you're preaching to skeptics. And I think that for skeptics, maybe the single, and this I must say is just generally is something that always strikes me as a newspaper columnist, that if I'm trying to persuade people, that so often the arguments that I think are the most persuasive on a given issue are actually the ones that are least persuasive to those who are on the fence. This particularly struck me a couple of weeks ago. I was writing about Islam and criticizing Islamophobia, and liberals read this and they just thought this was so compelling, so persuasive, and so on. And it struck me that a conservative website took my entire column and just pasted it on their website with some little, something at the top along the lines of, look how dumb those elitist liberals are. And they clearly thought that my exact arguments were just underscoring their own. And it was kind of sobering for me. And I think that often, that kind of pattern is often the case. In this realm, I think that the argument that often gets the most traction towards skeptics is a security argument. And I must say that here the evidence is somewhat thin. But I think it is there. And I mean, the record, frankly, if we're trying to figure out how we bolster security in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, well, military force has not a great record in that regard. It does seem to me that investing in women and girls, one can argue, has a somewhat better record. I would, partly I think because of the impact on birth rates, reducing that youth bulge, partly by bringing women out of the margins of society. One of the arguments about why the American West was so wild, if you will, was precisely that it was, all male. And I think there's an interesting contrast that one can perhaps make between Pakistan and Bangladesh and between Yemen and Oman. And each, well, Pakistan and Bangladesh were, of course, the same country until 1971. When Bangladesh started, it was famously described as a basket case by Henry Kissinger. The one thing that it kind of did was to educate people, and especially educate girls. And today, Bangladesh has more girls in high school than boys, which is a pretty extraordinary achievement. Those educated girls then laid the foundation for the garment industry in Pakistan, for civil society groups like BRAC, like Ramin, that have been so important for Bangladesh. And meanwhile, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, female literacy is 3%. I think that there is some correlation with the fact that, if there is another terrorist attack, it will probably have been planned in the tribal areas of Pakistan, in Waziristan, say, and not in Bangladesh. If it's not planned in the tribal areas of Pakistan, it'll have been planned in Yemen. And Yemen and Oman have a quite similar history. And then after the Sultan was deposed, they focused very much on education, and they really educated people. And as a result, nobody's worried about Oman today. So I think that, one can't generalize on the basis of two examples, but there's some broader evidence that suggests that over time, doesn't work perfectly, but that education and bringing women into the formal labor force has some kind of a beneficial effect in reducing civil conflict, reducing terrorism, nurturing economies over some kind of time scale. And I think that security argument maybe can help get traction.
Good. This session was originally supposed to last until 6 o'clock. We're going to extend it till 6:30 because I think there's a lot of questions in the room, until which time we have to go off to dinner with President Ahtisaari, I think the three of us. So just whoever would like to speak, let us know your name, where you're studying, what you're studying, and a question, and we'll start over here.
Thank you. My name's Mattia Kramer. I'm a Master of Public Policy candidate here in my second year. And thank you very much for being here with us tonight. This is a pleasure. My question is about your talk tonight and your book more broadly. Are we letting some people off the hook? And by some people, I mean men. In your story about, I don't remember her name, but you said she has a loser husband, right? And he's a gambler. And she saves the day. But what about his responsibility? And what about the responsibility of the heads of these states where these women come from, who are largely men, such as the world we live in, right? So could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. And I must say, and maybe this is just Y chromosome speaking in self-defense, but I think that there's sometimes a perception that the problem is men. And I think it's so much more complicated than that. And so many of the really terrible things that happen to women around the world happen at the hands of other women. And in addition, it always strikes me that if you ask women in polls their views about wife-beating, for example, the best predictor of whether somebody is for or against wife-beating is not whether they're male or female. It's their degree of education, and it's whether they live in a city or a rural area. And I guess what I would say is the problems tend to be patriarchal and sometimes misogynistic values but that those values can be absorbed and transmitted by women almost as much by men. And the way, in both cases, to address that is education of both boys and girls, and mechanisms to give women some income earning capacity so that they, it always seems to me that when women, in a sense, have commercial value, when they bring something to the table, that they also have more value in society. If you give them assets, likewise, that then they're treated better within marriage, within an extended family. But your larger point is certainly true, that men have to be part of this larger picture, have to be part of the solution, and I think there is some risk of thinking about this just as a women's movement as such. And I always think of the Holocaust wasn't just a Jewish issue, civil rights weren't just a black issue, and when 100 million women are missing around the world, that's not just a women's issue, it's a human rights issue for all of us.
Hello, thank you. My name is Rafaela Zaudema. I'm also a second year in the Master Public Policy program here. And I know myself and several other students here are actually going to the State Department after we graduate. And from that perspective, I was thinking if you had any thoughts on what people in government, both here in the United States and around the world, can do to try to advance these kind of issues on government agendas when, as Professor Burns was referencing, so often it's dominated by the sort of hardcore security political issues.
It's an interesting question, and I think Nick would probably have a better idea than mine about how to answer that. But it does seem to me that the agendas are changing, and whether it's the government agenda or a journalistic agenda. Nick talked earlier about what prime ministers and presidents do. If you look back at the way people wrote history, for most of history, it was about what kings and presidents did. And what we in journalism did was cover what those kings and presidents did. And then you began to have, over the last 50 years, the emergence first of history that was really about people and societies. And then journalism began to go in that direction as well. And now these issues like trafficking, like maternal mortality, or like development, are getting a serious discussion in the corridors of power. So I think that is happening and will be accelerated when more K-School students go into the State Department. I also, in the case of trafficking, for example, the fact that we have policy measures that actually proved to really work to some degree. And the fact that in 2000 we passed legislation that led to Trafficking in Persons Report, the annual TIP report, that rates countries on how they're doing. For the first time, Cambodia is the country I was kind of following most closely on this, but I was going regularly, and spent a lot of time in one brothel in particular, trying to understand that brothel owner's business model and what her thinking was. And it was interesting because as the State Department began to put more pressure on, Cambodia clearly began to worry about its place in the TIP report each year. And the national police chief then began to send word out to the local police chiefs to start arresting some traffickers, just to be able to tell the U.S., look, we arrested some people, we're doing something. And now many of the brothels were still owned by the police, in fact. It was not a solution to the problem. But the police did arrest a number of traffickers who didn't pay enough in bribes or who didn't have good connections with the police. And this brothel owner that I knew best, she was just a businesswoman. And she could earn a little bit more money kidnapping girls in rural areas and selling their virginity and then selling them, locking them up in the brothel than she could if she had some other business. And a few years ago, because of this pressure, she began to be worried that just maybe she might actually be arrested. It was very unlikely. It'd be like lightning striking, but there was that risk for the first time, and that worried her. It also, the other part of it was that the police they didn't ever close her brothel down, but they did begin to demand more in bribes. She was, she was paying $5 a day in bribes to the police. And she just decided at that point that economically it wasn't worth it. This had eroded her business model. She closed the brothel and turned it into a grocery store. You know, so there, you know, there are ways one can make a difference, chip away at some of these problems, even if real solutions are very elusive.
I would just add to what Nick had to say. If you're going into government, whether it's the U.S. government or any other government, the international agenda is changing quite dramatically. When I entered the Foreign Service in 1980, it was all about power and war and peace. That's where we were focused. Increasingly, these transnational issues are the heart of the international agenda, whether it's drugs, terrorism, crime, trafficking of women and children. And there's enormous activity now, state to state, in trying to resolve these problems and putting pressure on countries, including our own, by the way, because this all happens here too, to resolve them. So I think you'll experience as a diplomat, a modern day diplomat, which is one of the reasons I wanted Nick to be here today, a very different agenda than, say, Henry Kissinger steered when he was American Secretary of State 35 years ago, where individuals are at the focus of what we're doing. NGOs have power in the world, not just states. NGOs who often shame states into doing the right thing. So in that sense, it's a very interesting international environment. Yes.
Hi, my name is Karen. I'm at the Shorenstein Center. I live in Kenya and have for a number of years. I agree with everything you say about education, and especially girls, and my husband and I have sponsored many girls and boys in school. But I also teach at the University of Nairobi in the journalism department, and I see what happens to the communications majors. Most of them, like most of the other students at the university, get out and there are no jobs. So although education is important, what's really important is jobs. And I often joke that the best thing we could do is, you know, start a business, though we have no talent in that direction, and then we could hire people, and that would be a much more efficient thing to do than sponsor kids through education. It's not that that's not good, but the better thing would be to give people jobs, because then everybody that I see in Kenya has money. They send their kids to school, they get health for their kids, they do all of the things that middle-class Americans do, and poor Americans. People who have money, who have jobs, know exactly how to spend it on their kids. That's what they do. So I don't hear you talking much about the economic side of things. It's as though there are all these good missionary jobs, all these young people will go out and save the world. I think that's a kind of flawed model. It's not that some of this isn't useful, but at heart, if people have money, they know what to do for their families. What is your response to that?
I would agree. I would agree that I guess I would think of education more as a prerequisite for development, but not a sufficient condition. And I mean, one example, indeed, I would give would be East Asia and China in particular. That China had a lot of human capital for a long time, and in 1945, its per capita GNP was lower than at the end of the Song Dynasty in 1290, and you know, Mao built up human capital to a considerable degree, but it didn't do any good until Deng Xiaoping introduced market reforms beginning in 1978. Kerala in India has done a wonderful job with human capital because it's got a very sort of leftist government that cares about this, but that same leftist government has economic policies that are business unfriendly, and as a result it can't capitalize on them. So you need both. In the case of the developing world, I'm a great believer in manufacturing, partly because that's what I saw in East Asia, and so I take the view, I mean, I'm one of the few people in the world who really is a believer in the sort of low-wage manufacturing model, sort of the sweatshop, what we think of as a sweatshop model of East Asia. And you have some policy efforts to encourage that, things like AGOA in the case of Africa. I would love to see, there are going to be millions of jobs that are going to leave southern China, manufacturing jobs that are going to leave southern China in the coming years because of aging of the population, because of the currency revaluation, and some of those jobs could go to Africa. That would really be transformative, and I think one can try to do something more to encourage that. And women in particular tend to be beneficiaries of manufacturing jobs because they can compete in a manufacturing contest in a way that they cannot in a construction context. So I would not argue with you at all. Sorry.
Except that you didn't really speak about that at all. All of the things you talk about, and when you write, you're always writing about some wonderful NGO, not some wonderful business guy or woman who's started a factory and is employing people.
Well, but every 2 years I do a sort of sympathetic to sweatshop piece, and then then duck. In other words, if you try to figure out how you can encourage manufacturing in Lesotho, for example, it's a very it's a complicated set of conditions to figure out how you can grow it. And I do think that education is part of the prerequisite there. And one of the reasons that garment factories, for example, have not done better in Namibia or Lesotho is precisely that you don't have a broad enough spectrum of potential employees there, while Bangladesh, you do. And so, but I do agree that ultimately economic development is how you can do that. But it's also not true that it's just about government policy. I mean, BRAC in Bangladesh has been exceptionally effective in encouraging economic development and micro savings. I said I was a huge fan of micro savings. One of the great market failures in the world is that poor people don't have a mechanism to save money, and banks don't reach you. In West Africa, there are private money traders who will accept deposits. They charge 40% annual interest rates to accept your deposits. Who's going to save with them? And now, for the first time, we really do have, through cell phone technology, good ways to save. Cell phones will be the new savings banks and the new financial system. You'll save credits on, call-in credits on your cell phone, and you can transfer them to somebody else. That's the new banking system. That creates a mechanism to save, and I think it will, in turn, create some of the capital that people can then invest, and also creates a savings so that when a woman needs a C-section, the family actually has some money, and they can afford that C-section.
Yes. My name is Guru Karm Khalsa. I'm a web editor at Physicians for Human Rights. And I want to, one thing, say how moved I was by your remembrances of your father earlier this year.
Thank you.
And also energized by your column at Sunday on contraception. I hope that what you are envisioning as coming down the pike in the next few years will be true. I have a young daughter. She's actually later this year going to be going to Hyderabad to do an internship through her school, which is the University of Oregon.
Oh.
And she's very interested in international studies, in diplomacy and law, and I hope that, I'm going to send her a copy of your book. I hope that she will be also inspired to take that in maybe a different direction than she's thinking at this exact moment. Thank you very much for all you do.
Thanks so much.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Saima. I'm an MPP1. I'm originally from Bangladesh, and actually during my working with Grameen Bank beneficiaries, one conversation came to mind during your lecture was with a woman, and we were talking about her husband beating her, and she told me that if he didn't beat her in 2 weeks, she became worried that he didn't love her and that he was cheating on her. And I asked her what gave him the right to do that, and she said, it's just my culture, it's my religion. And to me, the biggest challenge with working with gender issues is that it's so deeply rooted in religion and culture and cultural and religious beliefs. So how do we overcome that? Do we talk to ulamas? Do we consult? Do we begin from there? Because I feel like we can't even go in because that's such a big barrier. So just address that.
It's a fascinating question, and to me, at least, the issue that illuminates that perhaps the best is female genital mutilation, because this is a 2 million girls in Africa alone get cut each year, many more in Indonesia and elsewhere around the world. And since the 1970s, you really had a major international effort to try to address this. And what had been called female circumcision was rebranded as female genital mutilation to create a real stigma about it. You had UN conferences. You had laws passed in country after country. I was in Guinea last year, and in Guinea, if you cut a girl and she dies, you face execution in theory. And I think if you just cut a girl, then I think it's life imprisonment or something. But these laws have been completely meaningless. 99% of girls in Guinea are still cut. And I think that we used a lot of these kind of international efforts to resolve problems as a substitute for grassroots action rather than a complement to it. And so since the 1970s, all of this sort of top-down effort really, I think, accomplished next to nothing. I was in Somaliland, and I remember seeing a banner across the main road, and they're denouncing FGM, but it was in English. Well, that's not going to do a lot of good. But meanwhile, you do have some of these grassroots organizations in Ghana, in Egypt, and the best known is Tostan, based in Senegal, that have been working from the grassroots with religious leaders to kind of educate people. And they've walked away from the FGM terminology and are now using FGC, cutting rather than mutilation, partly because it's a little awkward if you're having a conversation with a woman about whether to cut her daughter and you're suggesting that she is herself mutilated. It can be kind of a showstopper right there. And Tostan has had unbelievable success in ending cutting. And when I think back to foot binding in China, this was something that went back centuries and centuries. Emperors tried to ban it at one point. If you bound a girl's feet, you were subject to being exiled to Hainan. But it had no impact. And then, but actually, then in just a period of about 25 years, foot binding was completely eradicated because it went from being essential to marry your daughter to being an impediment to marrying your daughter. And that was all really done through these sort of grassroots initiatives at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. So don't despair.
Okay, why don't you go?
I really enjoyed the book. My mother keeps dropping subtle hints about me. She absolutely expecting me to change the world, so she sent it to me, and it's made its way to Ireland. So thank you very much for that. It actually dovetails a little bit with what you just answered, because I feel like I'm barking up the wrong tree completely because I've decided to go into law, and so far everything I've read about changing the world this way seems to suggest that anything I do is either not helping by doing nothing, or it's making things worse, because people then get complacent that things are being done when in fact nothing's changing. So I'm wondering, is there any role for law and people who are interested in changing things that way, rather than, or should I just give up completely and go and jump into the NGO sector?
Well, I'm a refugee from law. I studied law, and that convinced me to go to journalism. I'm maybe the wrong person to ask, but I guess I would answer it this way: that I think that Americans, and Europeans, because we're used to societies where laws matter, that we tend to think that if you want to get change, you pass a law. But in most of the world, a law has some relevance to life in the capital, and beyond the capital, not a lot of relevance. And so that too often when we try to achieve change, we focus on what the law says when there's so many other mechanisms that are important. But having said that, I really do see areas where a legal approach or a quasi-legal approach, a sort of regulatory approach, really makes a difference. And one example would be in trafficking issues in Cambodia, that the legal whether brothels were legal or not didn't really matter. But once the police began to actually throw some brothel owners in jail, then that really changed the calculations of the individual brothel owners about whether they should do this or not. And there's some evidence that in this country, a number of people have gone into pimping because there's a sort of self-interested calculation that if you want to go into some area of crime, then drugs was a much more dangerous play. You were much more likely to get arrested and probably serve a long time. While traditionally here, if you pimped, the girls you pimped might be arrested. You were not likely to face prosecution yourself, and until recently, if you did, you probably wouldn't go behind bars for long. So it made a lot of sense to go into pimping rather than heroin or whatever. And the other, so that is indeed a role of law, and also kind of institutional regulation. For example, one of the real problems with education is a kind of absenteeism we don't think about. It's not kids being away from school, it's teachers being away from school. In so much of the world, I mean, I very often I drop by schools when I'm just driving around in some country, and you just randomly drop in on a school. You ask how many teachers there supposed to be, and it turns out, 7 teachers. Well, there are actually only 2 teachers there today. And it turns out that, most teachers don't show up on a typical day. One study that I think MIT did suggested that at any given time, a country is earning less than $2,000 per capita income. I think only a third of teachers were actually teaching at any given moment, something like that. And if one can figure out institutional mechanisms so that teachers only get paid if they show up at work, or now there's a new effort in, I think, Tanzania where students can text a number if the teacher has not shown up. There are mechanisms that will suddenly really achieve a difference and get teachers to show up and provide some kind of institutional safeguards and improve governance. And governance, to me, seems the single best explanation for why some countries produce jobs and why others don't.
Last question.
Thank you so much for your work. Half the Sky had a tremendous impact on me when my mentor sent it to me when I was working in Uganda, so thank you. My question is with regards to something you said very early in your presentation, that gender inequity is the foremost moral challenge of the 21st century. Considering another one of our great challenges of the 21st century, climate change, I would posit that women and girls will shoulder a disproportionate burden of the effects on agriculture, on access to water, on access to education, on migration. And I wonder, do you agree with that? And if so, what advice would you have for those of us who are trying to support climate change adaptation activities?
Well, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of evidence that when resources are scarce and societies are under strain, that people, as I said, favor their sons over their daughters. And so if indeed climate change leads to more agricultural failures, as seems likely, then one would expect that girls would bear the brunt of the consequences. The other side of it is remedial action, and there's been some very interesting work suggesting that if we try to figure out how we can reduce the level of carbon emissions in the year 2100, that the most cost-effective way of doing that is to reduce population growth today. And there was, in particular, a British study that suggested, just extraordinarily cost-effective to reduce efforts to reduce birth rates today, which tend to get quite little investment, partly because reproductive health has become kind of radioactive politically. Very little investment in these technologies or in outreach programs. But if you can bring down birth rates, then over a period of 90 years or something, that has a tremendous impact on carbon emissions down the road. I must say that 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 study is not the last word on the subject, and there is a counter-argument that, you know, if the fact that you have lower birth rates leads to more economic growth, then people will adopt lifestyles such that even though there are many fewer people, per capita emissions will to some degree compensate for the decline in possible population. It still seems to me that it's a tremendously good investment for reducing long-term carbon emissions. I don't know how we create a market for carbon based on births prevented, but boy, that would be a lucrative market, and I bet some Kennedy School person can devise that. Thanks very much.
I want to thank Nick for an extraordinary 90 minutes of really intelligent, interesting discussion. I want to thank the Women in Public Policy program and Shorenstein for having co-hosted it, and thank you very much for being here.